Artists and creatives tend to have a lot of loves, a lot of things that get us excited about creating. Sometimes these overlap in logical ways, but sometimes, maybe often, each of our distinct loves have little to do with one another. Some might see this as a detrimental aspect of the creative mind, perhaps being pulled in too many distinct directions. But I would like to posit that having a wide array of creative outlets is actually better for us than honing in on one single thing only. Well, what do I mean by multiple creative outlets? For many artists, this is simply going to expand into several different mediums. If you follow anything I do on this channel, you know that I tend toward working on drawings with ink. But I also work in watercolor, in gouache, acrylic, and oil, and even several digital mediums. I stay away from sculpture and pottery due to some traumatic classes in my undergrad, but we don't need to talk about that here. So this is what it looks like for most artists: the utilizing of multiple, different, and sometimes very disparate artistic mediums. But it can actually be much more broad than this. Music is a common overlap, as is dancing, writing, even some forms of creative cooking. The artistic mind is not usually limited to visual media alone, and often steps out into other realms entirely. That out of the way, let's talk about some of the great benefits that come from working in and dedicating yourself to multiple disciplines. Cross-pollination is the first category that I want to dive into, and this often results primarily from an exposure to different mediums. Each medium has its own specific ways of handling things, and though many are tailored specifically to their point of origin, there is significant bleed over in many areas. Watercolor, for example, functions a particular way, different from other painting mediums, but each has pieces that can be brought into the others. In general, if you are working in watercolor, you are working in slow layers, building everything up across your paper, the paper absorbing portions of the water and then drying over time. If you're working in acrylic, the paint dries quite quickly and it actually builds up physically on top of the surface that you're working on. Oil is much more similar to acrylic, but it also dries very slowly, which means you have the ability to work in and blend colors together for a longer period of time. But what happens if you take oil and you mimic some of the things that you might do in watercolor if you water it down? I mean, you're not literally watering it down, you're using a solvent of some kind. You get very different results, and it is watercolor-esque. You can do the same thing with acrylic, actually, very much watering down and diluting your acrylic paint, and you can actually get some translucent effects this way. Now, these techniques are not only watercolor techniques, of course, as they're brought into other things, but it's easier sometimes if you branch out, if you spend your time working in multiple mediums, to think about things from a slightly different angle. If you work only in ink, especially if you're only using pens like you see me doing here in the background and as we move through this drawing, then that's a pretty finite medium. But if you spent some time working with something like watercolor or acrylic, and you get the crazy idea to start using a brush to move your ink around the page, well, you get dynamically different things. And of course, ink washes and ink painting are not uncommon things. They're not particularly common in the US most of the time, but they are a dignified medium in and of their own right. But if you start thinking about ink as simply the pigment that is staying on your page, and you start coming at it from many different angles, the amount of things that you can do is really rather remarkable. Drawing in general is quite different from painting, but there are certain things that can be brought over. Can you draw out your painting before you begin? So I used to think, and I was taught, that when you paint, you really need to think of it as being very different from drawing. That it is a thing based on color and shape, and that drawing is about line and value. And whilst there is some truth to that, they're more connected than I was led to believe initially. In fact, when I was teaching, one of the classroom rules was that drawing and painting are basically two sides of the same coin, that we should aim to not think of them as being separate entities, but that they're just different ways of representing things. And this was borne out most strongly in the fact that some students really really gravitated towards painting over drawing, and vice versa, of course. But because of the way that our culture is set up here, a student who might have a predilection for painting might not even get the chance to understand that aspect of themselves unless they specifically try to explore it. So what this led to over time, as I taught more students, as I worked on my own paintings, was realizing that there's no shame in sketching out on your canvas. I was led to believe in my undergrad that if you drew with a pencil on your canvas, this was blasphemous. This was this terrible thing. And I now tend much more towards sketching out with paint on my canvases. So before I start a painting, I will often just very much water down, dilute whatever paint I'm working with. And then I will use a filbert brush, which is the round edged one, and I will very quickly just sketch things out. This allows me to work on proportions, composition, and it's really easy to edit things. Even if I'm working in oil paint, I can take a little bit of my solvent and soak a rag or a paper towel in it and erase portions of that sketch if I need to move things around. So I've started taking some of the things that come really from drawing into my painting. Now the other side of that is, can you paint out your drawing before you begin? And actually, if you watched really closely at the beginning of this drawing that's happening in the background, it's kind of how I worked on putting this together. Not precisely, but my sketch for this is very, very sketchy. And often my sketches with a lot of these robots lately have been much more painterly. I'm focusing on shapes, and I'm not really focusing on any kind of detail with my sketching. Not even really composition most of the time, though a little bit more for a piece like this that's going to take the entire page. But what I'll start doing is just drawing out rectangles and organic shapes and spheres and cylinders. And I'm thinking of it much more as a painter would. Like, these are all these shapes. Let's shove them together and make sure that the shapes make sense together. And then we'll start moving it on things. And really, again, at the end of the day, drawing and painting are not particularly different from one another. We think of them more differently than they are actually different. As you start to expand to try out different mediums, you're going to find that you learn different things from them, and aspects of those mediums come into whatever form of art you're working on. Now, if you step outside of artistic mediums, like I mentioned earlier, you can often be exposed to different methodologies that are native to other arenas. So, how do you write a song, and how do you put a piece together? Are they particularly different? And how can one impact another? So when I go to write a song, generally, it starts from me just sitting down and fiddling until something interesting happens on my guitar. There's actually two distinct different ways that I write, and I'll talk about both of these. But generally speaking, I'm just sitting at my guitar. I've probably been playing for a few minutes, warming up maybe, but not usually, or I'll warm up playing something that I wrote. And then I'll just start fiddling. And if I run into something that's interesting, I'll record that. So think of that as a quick sketch, a quick thumbnail of some kind. And I'll go, oh, that's interesting, and I'll record it. And then I'll listen to it a few times, or I'll keep playing on it. I have less stress because that particular moment of that song's genesis is now recorded. And it's not perfect. They're never perfect at first. In fact, they're often very, very simple. And then as I start to build on that, I'll think about what that's indicating. What kind of mood does that have? Is this part fast? Is it slow? It's going to need something to counter that as I move into the next portion of the song, whether that's intro, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, whatever structure it is that I'm kind of thinking about. So I will start to riff on what I've already built and continue to manipulate it and pull it out. That translates over to how I draw. And this is something that can happen for you too if you are investing time into another kind of creative field. As I start to put a drawing together, or the idea for the children's book that I'm working on, I start with my quick ideas and sketches. And there's a certain solace and emotional calm that comes from knowing that nothing that I do initially has to be perfect. A lot of the music work has helped me to get to a point where I understand that this is also the same for my writing and for my art. And so as I start to work through that song, just riffing on thing after thing after thing, eventually I'll solidify it into something that I like. And then generally I'll record a batch of it, I'll listen to it over time and try to figure out what kind of mood the song has, what kind of lyrics might fit with it. And then once I know which way the lyrics are going to go, what the song's actually about, things will change dramatically, because then I can really hone in on what it is. And that actually brings me to the second way that I will put a song together, which is essentially I will put a song together with purpose and with intent. This might sound silly, but not every one of your drawings comes together with specific intent, right? So sometimes I'll sit down and I go, I need a song to deal with this. I need a song that deals with abandonment. I need a song that deals with the idea that your body is broken and you're not to blame for it, but you need to blame somebody, or the fact that you miss somebody so terribly that it feels like the whole world is breaking apart or you've been betrayed. If I have that kind of idea, that tells me, is it a major song or a minor song? For me, a lot of the times it will tell me what kind of time signature I want to use. If it's really, really complicated, if it has something to do with something that's off kilter, I might use 5/4 or try the dreaded 7/8, which I still can't really write well in. Most songs I write end up being in 3/4 or 6/8 because those are the best time signatures. But every once in a while, I'll go into, 4/4 because, I guess that's what the kids like these days. But those kinds of things will dictate the direction that I go. And I can't help but notice that comes into effect when I'm working on my art. That sometimes the mood is the directive. It's the thing that points me in the direction that I need to go. But often it's the fiddling, it's the playing that gets me just started. And then I can slowly manipulate things. And I think all of it comes down to not thinking that you have to be married to the thing that you started. You can always change details. Even when you're working in ink like I am here right now, there are ways to manipulate it, to change things if your decisions change as you go through the project. So that's a little bit of how songwriting affects how I make art. What about writing? Well, this is actually interesting because writing has been a newer thing for me, but I tend to write like I paint. And when I paint, I know that I can layer on as many layers that I want to, that the bottom layer can be super ugly or discordant or make little sense, and then I can continue to build on top of that. I've run into a lot of writers and read a lot of reviews and feedback from people who are trying to write a book. And many get stumped trying to get like the first chapter correct or the first quarter of the book like perfect. And I feel like I'm untethered to that idea because I feel like when I write, I'm writing like a painter, that I know I can just layer it, that getting my first sketch, as it were, onto the page is going to be more beneficial than spending a ton of time trying to figure out the perfect composition and layout and plot and all that. So as I've started to look back at the first part of the book that I finished my first draft on, I'm kind of looking at it and going, well, the bones are good here. Like the sketch is good, but the dialogue is a little funky and it feels immature. It feels younger than I want the book to be. But the nice part is that like all the data is there. So now I can go in and I can refine all the pieces. And that's like going back for your second or third pass on a painting, where you get the chance to go in and refine the details and bring the beauty out. So ironically, music has affected the way that I make art, but art has affected the way that I write. And I find that it's super beneficial. Like I don't get hung up on things nearly as much with my writing because I've spent so much time drawing and painting. So I see these wonderful overlaps that have made my life more pleasant, and also it gives me a unique take on things. It makes my journey just a little bit different. The last thing that I want to touch on with the cross-pollination here is that there are different problem-solving skills associated with each of these arenas creatively. Each medium by its nature has certain ways to solve problems, and these change significantly when they're brought into other mediums. So if you work with ink as a single thing, drawing with pens and ink, your goal is precision. Your goal is to get everything down exactly where you want it. And for a long time, that's how my ink drawings look. And I think that they were less interesting until I started allowing a little bit of randomness in there. But if you start to think about acrylic or oil painting, you have less control in those mediums because partially you're using a giant brush that isn't going to give you this minuscule finite detail, but also like the mediums themselves have a little bit of character to them, especially if you're using oil paint that's ancient like I do all the time because it lasts for a really long time. So when you're working with ink, if your goal is this like absolute precision and there is all of a sudden a splatter or a pool of ink, or you're using a brush pen like I am right now and it flays out a little bit and you get a wider stroke, those things can be panic inducing and they can be a problem that you can't really solve if you're just looking at it through the ink lens. But if you're looking through it as a painter, if you're looking through it as a graphite drawer, then all of a sudden that adds a little bit more character to things. It gives you the opportunity to, okay, is there a dent in that part of the robot right there? Is the shading working a little bit more funky? But at the end of the day, it kind of unhinges some levels of stress. So all of a sudden, it's not such a big deal that something like that happens. I used to work with ink, actual dip ink, a long time ago, where I would dip the pen into the ink and then splatter the ink onto the page, and it would pool in all these tiny little areas, but it would not soak in immediately. It would literally pool on top of the surface. And then I would take my pen and I would scratch out of that to create shapes. And inevitably you run out of ink because as you stretch the ink out of that pool, the pool depletes. But you could create these really interesting and strange drawings because you had a very finite resource that you had no control of, and you had no control of where it landed on the page either. And so you get these really interesting things. I've seen this actually with a lot of creature and even some character designers, where if they're in a slump or they're just working on a warm-up, they will give themselves a whole bunch of random shapes, and those are just the shapes that they have to turn into characters or creatures. And that's the same thing for this kind of ink process, this ink practice. It gives you the opportunity to do something that your natural mind wouldn't quite do. Now, this is just one example of how exploring different creative outlets, different creative mediums, will give you some abilities to solve problems in different and unique ways. Really, a lot of it will just help you think outside of the box more, which for us as creatives seems to almost always be a good thing. The second category I would like to look at is technical skill development. So obviously, if you are working on a single medium, you're working only on drawing, you are going to accelerate at a pretty quick pace your skills in that area. But I would also wager that overlapping and dipping into other areas will actually let you accelerate your growth faster, and often in more intriguing ways. This isn't to say that if you put 50% of your time into drawing and 50% of your time into painting that you will be a better painter and drawer given the same amount of time as somebody who put all of their time into one or the other. That's a convoluted way of saying that. But if you were looking at it like a video game where you're putting half your skill points into one and the other, and you get to level 10 and you've got 5 points in painting and 5 points in drawing, and another person has 10 points in drawing, you are going to be a little bit more powerful than they are because you've got some of those overlapping things. Now, you're not going to have quite the specific skills. You're going to be a little bit more of a jack of all trades. But if they've got 10 points, I would say there's probably some weird amplification thing happening there, and you probably have 11 or 12. That might be a funny way to think about it, but the idea here is that you have a versatility that doesn't come from just focusing on a singular thing. When you focus on multiple artistic means of expression, you learn different ways of doing things. Sometimes this is going to apply directly, like we talked about earlier, that you're going to have a painting technique that you're going to employ in a drawing and vice versa. But a lot of times, if you are working in paint, for example, the amount of fine motor skills necessary to control that brush are very different than the skills necessary to control a pencil. I find that when I spend a lot of time working on watercolor, where my wrist has to move at a very specific angle to make the brush do what I want it to do, that my control of my pencil is greatly improved. And so there are finite motor skills that are improved by working on multiple things. This probably comes into a really strong effect if you're working in 3D mediums in a lot of ways. If you are working with clay or if you're working sculpturally, you're developing like whole muscle groups and things like that. You're probably not going to have as many wrist and elbow and shoulder issues as, drawers and painters do because we spend so much of our time hunched over things. I guess I should have mentioned back issues too, but maybe I don't even want to think about my back because I'm always a little bit worried about it hurting. So there are massive benefits that come from sliding from painting into drawing in that aspect alone. When you move from drawing to painting, you think about things a little bit differently. You can isolate things in different ways. Sometimes the fine details that you're going to put on a painting are going to be easier if you've spent a lot of time working on drawing. Paintings are often larger than drawings. We don't tend to work on a lot of 2 by 3 feet drawings, but working on 2 by 3 foot paintings is very, very common, and they can go much, much larger than that, obviously. But you're working with these big brushes and you're covering large swaths of area in color. If you're working on a lot of time spent drawing, then that minutia, the tiny little details, can come in and make these wonderful polished effects on the final version of that painting. A lot of the times when I'm starting to work on any painting that has an animal or a creature or a human in it, I will kind of get my initial sketch down and then do my first layer of paint, and then I'll start working on the eyes because they're kind of the most important part. Like if I'm working on a portrait of a person and everything's pretty sketchy, but the eyes are pretty nice, if they're pristine in some way or they're just interesting, the rest of it will kind of be forgivable in a way. So that gives you the ability to kind of hone in on the thing that is most important. So sculpture teaches you how to focus on form in a real way. This is one of the best benefits of working with three-dimensional art forms, even if they are like digital sculpting, is everything you do with drawing and painting is giving the illusion of three-dimensionality in form. And when you actually work with a three-dimensional thing, your brain doesn't have to go that extra step to create that illusion. It doesn't have to kind of posit these things. It can just literally see them. So I find that sometimes building a model or working with a three-dimensional medium in some capacity is very, very helpful for just my understanding of form. I know a lot of artists keep little models of various kinds on their desks to help them in this capacity. I have on many occasions just kept a little cube or a box or even dice, kind of normal shapes around my workspace. And that way, when I'm working on tough perspective things, I can hold it up and kind of look at it and go, would I see that face from this angle? Would I be able to understand it this way? If I look at it this way, is it really just going to be a square? That's kind of boring. Do I need to shift it? So focusing on three-dimensional art forms can really help you to understand the illusion of three-dimensionality that you're putting into your drawings and paintings. A lot of these robot drawings that I've been working on have vastly improved as I've thought about what all of the surfaces are. Where they are in space, yes, but like how light is affecting them and three-dimensionally what they actually are. When you look at the stage that this drawing's in right now, it doesn't have a lot of that. You can see some perspective on the arms, but most of it doesn't have any. When I start putting in the hatching and the shading, which might not even really happen on this podcast, might happen on the next one, but it really starts to come together and make a lot more sense. And that's been something that I've learned by spending a lot of time thinking about three-dimensional things. A lot of time that probably could have been saved if I'd spent some more time working in three-dimensional mediums. The biggest thing though for technical skill development here is its adaptability and versatility. That the more different artistic mediums you work in, the more adaptable you are for the unique trials that you're going to run into. When I started looking at concept art originally, I was probably in high school. It's when I had the aspirations of doing it, aspirations that I eventually understood were probably over my head at that point and probably still over my head in a lot of capacities. It seemed to me back then that most artists honed in on a single thing. They drew, they painted, they digitally drew, they digitally painted, they sculpted, and that was about it. Being a big fan of The Lord of the Rings, watching all the behind the scenes stuff there, it seemed like even there was very little branching out, and that would have been like late 90s, early 2000s for when they were working on those films. There was a little bit of cross training for the guy who does like the airbrushing for the actual models and for some of the prosthetics, and they taught him how to like digitally paint so that the skin could look accurate for Gollum. But nowadays, it seems like most proficient and professional concept artists, they use a whole bunch of different things. Like they sketch with pencils and then they draw and paint on 2 or 3 different artistic programs. And then they design three-dimensionally in ZBrush or another program like that. And sometimes they get assets and arrange them so they got the composition the exact way they want. I'm thinking of people like Tyler Edlin here. He's just one that I can think of off the top of my head that does this in a lot of his work. He employs several different artistic mediums in just his normal workflow. And that seems to be really common these days because it gives you that adaptability, that versatility. So if you are just looking to hone in on your normal artistic skills, or if you're looking to get into the industry at some point, it seems that this is a benefit either way. I think I'm going to wrap up this podcast here, but hold on just a moment so you can understand what's going on in this head of mine. I have about half the script left to go through, but as I'm looking at them, this first half is really about technical skills. It's about real and physical things. And as I'm looking at the bullet points heading forward, they're all about kind of the emotional benefits. Things like a broader means of self-expression, artistic self-care, personal connections, emotional benefits, long-term sustainability as an artist. To me, all of these things are kind of grouped together. They belong as a single entity. And whilst I could continue to put them here, I have a feeling that that would push this podcast another 25 to 30 minutes into the future. I'm not sure this episode needs to go to that length. So I think I'm going to cut it here and tune in to our next podcast where we'll talk about those kinds of things, like the artistic self-care, the emotional components, which are just as important, if not more important, for our long-term sustainability as artists. In fact, that's one of the points. So, as always, thank you for your time. I really appreciate you listening, your comments, and just taking a portion of your day to spend some time with me. I hope that this has been beneficial to you. If you're looking to join an artistic community, we have a Discord server attached to this channel, and you can find the link for that in the description below. It's a small community where we basically just assist each other. We help each other with common artistic things, including feedback on our artwork, and just a space to talk to other people who probably have dealt with or are dealing with a lot of the same things that you are. We also have a Patreon for this channel if you're looking to support me here and what I do. It just helps me kind of keep moving forward, and it gives you the opportunity to see what's going on behind the scenes. Give me some feedback on outlines on podcasts like this and other things that I can include, or even potentially podcasts that we could do in the future. In that train of thought, thank you to patron Who, What, Where, When and Pale Spider for your continued support. It is very much appreciated. Well, have a good one, y'all. I'll see you next time for part 2.